When you talk about business resilience or dare I say business continuity, it's a bit of an old school term and it conjures up images of people dusting off an old binder in the corner and trying to understand what their core business is. And it's not exactly on top of everybody's list. But as security folks, we tend to get a bad name because we tend to think about the worst things that can happen and we can be pessimistic. I prefer realist, but by thinking about the worst things, you really do get going to prepare yourself for the worst. And then the better you're prepared to handle those things, the better you're going to be prepared to keep your business running in a time of crisis.
This is KBcast.
Are they completely
As a
cybersecure?
primary target for ransomware campaigns,
Is security and testing and performance and scalability.
risk and
We
compliance.
can actually automate that.
Take that data and use it.
Joining me today is Fred Thiele, Chief Information Security Officer from Interactive, and today we're discussing the importance of cybersecurity for business resilience. So Fred, thanks for joining and welcome.
Thanks, Carissa. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's talk about business resilience. So everyone talks about cyber resilience, now business resilience, but what's your sort of definition, or how would you define business resilience in your words?
I take a pretty simplistic approach to most of this stuff. And to me, business resilience is really about the ability, how it is that you protect your core business and the ability for your core business to operate under a wide variety of adverse scenarios. So I don't know who said it, but somebody said it: hope for the best, prepare for the worst, and be unsurprised by anything in between. And I think that's kind of how I like to think about it. You really prepare for the worst thing that you think could possibly happen. And that normally prepares you in the business for, whatever may come. And then if you are prepared for that, then nothing in between is really going to surprise you. And you'll be able to sort of ad lib and continue to keep the business running through that particular business resilience period.
So you said before, prepare for the worst, or the worst thing that could happen. Would you say people are thinking like that? And the reason why I asked that question is simply because everyone's trying to keep their head above the water. Look, now it's Christmas time. Everyone's trying to get everything done. Do you think people are sort of sitting back and saying, oh, well, what is the worst thing that could happen? Or are they just so busy with their day-to-day that sometimes these conversations are sort of pushed down the proverbial laundry list?
Yeah, I think they do get pushed down quite a bit. And, when you talk about business resilience or dare I say business continuity, it's a bit of an old school term and it sort of, conjures up images of people dusting off an old binder in the corner and trying to understand what their core business is, what kind of applications they have, what's really important to them. And it's not exactly on top of everybody's list, but us as security folks, we tend to get a bad name because we tend to think about the worst things that can happen, and we can be pessimistic. I prefer realist, but we can kind of think about the worst things that happen. But by thinking about the worst things, you really do get going to prepare yourself for the worst. And then the better you're prepared to handle those things, the better you're going to be prepared to keep your business running in a time of crisis. So I do think it gets pushed down. I do think everybody's really, really busy, but I do think it's also important to take the time out and, really understand where you are. What are your most business critical applications? How do you protect those things? When's the last time you tried to operate without one of those or ran a scenario, those, for example? And a lot of those can come in really handy when you're speaking to ELT or boards. They tend to really like to see that business continuity in action because it's no longer a matter of if, but when, as we all know.
Okay, so the operative word you said, prepared. So everyone on this show, just in general, we got to get prepared. We got to get an IRP like your plan, and we got to get practice it. But then I feel like sometimes when push comes to shove, like getting a plan and all of that and practicing it. But then when you're in the real life incident, some of those plans go out the window. So what would be your approach around getting prepared? Because we can get prepared all we want, but sometimes when it's the day, the plan and the preparedness sometimes gets missed.
And I think this is where the ad lib comes in, or where the be unsurprised by anything comes in. Because if you have the right people who are trained up, and maybe if you can dream up 100 things that could go wrong with the business, focusing on just those, maybe just focus on the top 5 things that could go wrong. And you get everybody trained up, you get everybody understanding what does happen when these really important business applications go down. What does happen when we can't provide our core business to our customers? And you run through a few of those scenarios. It's not just about running through the scenarios. It's about understanding things like, what's the decision-making framework when bad things happen. Who's in charge? Why are they in charge? What decisions do they make? What authority do they have to make? What decision do you have in that decision-making framework as a CISO or a CIO or a CFO? And when people understand their roles and they're trained up properly, you've got the technology, the people in the process, like everything else in tech and within a business. And the more that those people are trained up, the better you'll be able to ad lib. And maybe you didn't cover the step-by-step scenario that does present itself someday, but you have the right people in the room. They're trained up in how it is that the business continuity framework works. They're trained up on who gets to make decisions and why and how. So all of that comes together into a machine that can take on and be unsurprised by anything that might present itself.
Okay, so I want to go back to decision makers. So one thing that you would know, and we've seen this in breaches when you're trying to get a response, but sometimes, obviously working in media, there was a large retailer, they got breached, etc. I was trying to chase them for a comment. They eventually gave it to me, but it was like, oh, I have to ask general counsel. It was like, general counsel is not a cyber person, right? So it's like we try to make these decisions, but sometimes the decisions are being in the hands of people that aren't necessarily, they don't actually understand how all of this works to the nth degree. So how do you sort of divvy up the pie where it's like, okay, this person's responsible for that. There's a lot of interdependencies with these things, but how do you manage it when it's like someone has to make a decision? However, is the person making the decision informed?
Yeah, and there is a bit of an art to that, but I think, by defining what roles you have in a room and what those roles can decide or can't decide. Technical decision making, for example. So some of the things that I've seen in business continuity plans in the past are things like if there's, you would typically have, say, during a cyber incident, you would have a cybersecurity incident response plan that's very specific to, say, a cyber incident that's running. And that's going to be very different from what the overarching business continuity plan says. So business continuity is how do we keep the business running? What do we need to do if these applications or services or people aren't available? What's the alternative, et cetera. But when you're dealing with a cyber incident or any kind of specialized skill set, could be, if you physical security, could be terrorism, bombings, that kind of thing, whatever the specialty is, you need to have playbooks for those things. So that when the general counsel comes or the CEO comes and says, hey, we need to talk to our customers and make a decision on how to communicate with our customers, having the right people in that decision-making framework. So the specialty skill, whether that be the CIO or the CISO comes in and says, look, here's where we are with the incident. Here's the rundown. We're following our cybersecurity incident response plan. And you can feed into the right place where that decision gets made, whether that be with legal counsel, if say you've got some privacy concerns about something, or, you need to communicate with your customers about your contractual requirement being missed, or maybe the CEO needs to go out with messaging to all the customers because the service isn't available. You can, if you've got the right people in that room, you can give all of the information or provide what we like to say in cyber is all the situational awareness for that particular information, or for that particular scenario, so that the decision can be made knowing as much about what we know about at any given point.
So you mentioned before, Fred, keeping the business running. So one thing that and you would probably know this more than myself, but one thing that's coming up a lot in interviews and just conversations is recently with the outage that was there, that sort of was interesting because look at Delta Airlines, like how much they impact their business of not being able to operate like all of their flights and how much revenue they lost due to that, and forget about reputational and all the other things, but just the business not being able to run at all, how much that impacted them. So do you think now the shift is we have to keep things running at all times and we are beholden on a lot of these technology companies out there, but would you say that now the conversation is shifting towards purely on the business can't stop, so therefore people, and they've seen it happen multiple times, not even just an incident, an outage. And now I've seen people's mindset change a lot. Do you have any insight on that front?
Yeah, I think, you referred to the outage, and that was, I don't know if that's going to be a once in a lifetime type of event. You can certainly imagine a scenario where it could happen again, but it's all about understanding what is core to your business. And, in business continuity terms, you refer to it as a C1, C2, C3, criticality 1, criticality 2, criticality 3 type of process or technology that runs your business. there's an understanding around each one of those classifications of, how long can you go out without having this process in place. So for example, you might classify one of your criticality one systems as something that you cannot operate the business over 4 hours of outage, for example. Might be that critical, whatever that might be. Could be, flight terminals or, gate information or whatever it might be from an airline's perspective. I can give you an example. We had a fairly big cyber incident that ended up taking out all of IT. So whether it's laptops, servers, applications, and this was a business that had, 40 or 50 some business applications that were running at any given point, all IT gone. When I arrived at that company, their business continuity plan was basically one line: fall back to pen and paper. And you can't help but look at that and go, okay, well, it seems to be a fairly easy business continuity plan. How doable is that actually? So there's a lot of work around the BC plan for that particular company. But then when the stuff really did hit the fan, that's exactly what they did. They went straight back to pen and paper. They're a bit of an old school business, so they were able to do that. Now, the key was not that there was no IT and those were all critical systems. Sure, they were. The key is, how long can you actually operate your business on pen and paper or within that business continuity scenario, right? Because what ends up happening is that you might run really well for the first hour or day or week or whatever, but over time, the business starts degrading. And typically that's kind of like a hockey stick type of degradation where you're chugging along, everything's fine. And then it kind of gets a little bit worse and a little bit worse. And then it gets a lot worse because all of the things that you rely on, whether it be, things that happen on a weekly basis automatically within your technology and processing systems, those aren't available anymore. And so in this particular scenario, IT was gone for 5 or 6 weeks. This was a company that really needed a lot of those systems. It was a safety critical operation. So when those aren't available, or you have to fall back to manual transactions for a period of time, those really start degrading the company. So if you go back to the outage, if the outage was more than, 6 hours or whatever it ended up being before things righted themselves a bit again. I know some people had a longer period of time than that, but you should be able to evaluate those systems and go, where are my single dependencies? If I didn't have those, how am I going to continue to operate the business? And for how long can I reasonably operate the business under those conditions before I really start to feel the pain? So nothing's going to be 100% up, and you're never going to have 100% uptime. But the key is to really understand what those critical systems are and how long you can operate without them under those conditions.
So going back to the pen and paper, how long was it? Did you say 4 to 6 weeks that they could operate like that?
Yeah, we ended up operating like that for, I think it was 5 or 6 weeks. And that really started to hurt. The people were hurting, the systems were hurting, things started to fall out of date fairly quickly. There was a lot of pressure to get everything back up and running.
So then going back to your comment around reasonably operate, wouldn't you say with today and how things are built, it'd be quite instant that people would start feeling the pain? 4 or 5 weeks, I couldn't even imagine majority of companies handling that at all. It'd be a few hours, if that, people would start to feel pain. Even when the telco incident happened, I didn't have any internet, I couldn't do anything. So even just that impacted and I couldn't even I think you could make phone calls, but that was it. So with that reasonably operate, people would just be impacted straight away, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, again, it depends. It depends on what the service is. Obviously, telco, internet, people are going to notice that straight away. When your flights aren't taking off on time and there's 4-hour delays or 3-day delays, yeah, that's impacting people, right? That's huge. So I think there's thresholds, and it's really important for businesses that run those kinds of critical systems, those time critical systems, know what those dependencies are. And you may or may not have a backup plan, right? But part of this is just knowing and understanding, okay, this is a really critical system. If this widget, process, set of people go away, whatever the case may be, my business is going to be hurting. But just knowing that, often just getting to the bottom of that with all the complicated systems that we all have in place to run, say in the airline business, the orchestra that is, takeoff and landing, there's a million different things that happen. And all of those are interconnected. So understanding what those real process points are that will absolutely kill the business and, impact people, it's really important to first understand those, because I think a lot of companies just simply don't understand where those pain points are within their massive infrastructures or processes. But 2, if you've identified those things, then what is the fallback plan? And, one of the things that's really interesting about first identifying those systems is that you can then take those to ELT or board and say, we've identified these systems and we have zero backup plan if they ever go out. And you can test that. You develop a scenario to see what would happen if those things did go down. And then that provides insight and findings into, all right, how are you going to fix this in the future to make sure that those worst case scenarios that you just imagined, that you prep for them, or at least you have the right decision-making framework in place to continue the business operating in times of crisis.
So I want to talk about reliance now on systems, technology companies. Like I said, people are not operating on pen and paper. So obviously we've moved past that, and we are reliant on these companies to stay up and running. And like you said, things can happen. We've seen that. If large company had an issue, people were impacted. Would you say, Fred, the conversations that you're having, are these people really worried about this? Because there's no other way around it. Like, they have to use these companies to run their business effectively, which means there's always going to be that risk and stuff that they necessarily may not be able to control either in terms of the supply chain. So would you say companies now, after what we've seen in recent times and years, people are quite worried about what could happen?
Absolutely. And I think it's one of those things where you go back to one of the previous points we were talking about was having that subject matter expertise in the room. It becomes really important because a lot of these things will be invisible to business leaders and people running a business, especially non-technical leaders, right? The more we're reliant on technology, the more that we need people who are familiar with technology concepts and vendors and that kind of thing in the decision-making chairs. And before the outage, there's many people in the world who wouldn't have ever heard of that product before. And now it's plastered all over the news, right? So, there's an awareness piece there of, yep, we're dependent on a lot of different vendors that require subject matter experts to run them, to configure them, to keep them operational, and world-class companies to keep them up and to fix things when they do break. But again, if you look at what's happening in the cloud space, public cloud, for example, people have been branching out now for a while into different public clouds. So one public cloud, even though they might have 16 nines of availability, sometimes, that whatever 2 or 3 hour outage isn't going to cut it. So you have a concept of multi-cloud. So if one cloud goes down, another cloud can spin up. But then that adds not only redundancy, but also complexity, because then you've got to get the systems to work in those multiple clouds when one does go down. And so I guess I'm kind of painting a picture that, yeah, it's complicated out there, and people are trying to find ways to diversify and make sure that they've got the right things in place so that when their critical systems do go down, they continue to operate. But, we've seen a lot of vendor consolidation. We've seen a lot of critical points via vendors. When a vendor has, sits in the middle of a laptop and an operating system and watches everything that goes by suddenly goes down, well, that's going to impact a lot of things. And that's just core to how it is that, laptops operate these days. And very similar with public cloud. If something gets in the middle of your public cloud, your website or your e-commerce site or whatever the case may be, you've got to have an answer for that. Do you fall back to prem? Do you on-prem? Do you go back to a different cloud provider? Do you, go back to pen and paper and have a bunch of people calling the call center and, a bunch of people spun up to continue to take orders during those outage periods? It's all really important to understand how that all fits together. When you mention about third or fourth parties, that's a whole different ball of wax that, a lot of regulation is currently driving requirements into businesses on how to deal with those things. And there's no easy answer for it.
So when you were speaking, what was coming up in my mind around leaders and boards and executives, traditionally, a lot of these people at that level don't have any background in IT. So will we start to see an emergence of people at that level that have an IT background? Now, I'm asking this because one thing, after writing reports, as you know, for executives, that a lot of these people at times just assume that technology works. It's like electricity. I just turn the light on, it works. So when it doesn't work, you notice it. So will we start to see more leaders now? And I know that, CISO and, and friends are getting more seats at the table. I know it's sort of coming in, but in terms of even like CEOs and CFOs, like if they don't have a very strong background in tech or understanding it, it's going to make it harder to get that buy-in. But also, like, all these companies are all built on technology now. And like traditionally, in my experience in the last 15 years, there hasn't been a lot of these people that have really been across technology at all at these levels. So it's kind of like, no wonder we've had a lot of issues, because we're dealing with people that don't necessarily understand it.
Yeah, I agree. And it's I don't know if it's an old guard versus new guard kind of thing that we're seeing the transition now of, but you can't operate a business without having some level of table stakes, I think, from a technology perspective. And whether that be making sure that you have the right technical expertise or at least know-how within the company that, you bring the right people to the table when a decision needs to be made. I've seen it firsthand as we're going through that transition of more technical people or more technically aware people making their way into leadership, executive leadership, and even on boards. It's really important to be able to tell that story, that business story, in a way that's understandable by people who may not be technical. And I think whilst it's, I believe, incumbent on anybody who's in a leadership or decision-making role to have some awareness around technology and some of the processes that run your core business, it's up to us as technologists and technology executives to be able to have the words in our vocabulary to be able to tell the story and how it is that everything fits together, because it can get immensely complicated, even if you're doing, product development or something, and people might ask, well, why does it take so long to deploy XYZ feature? It's like, well, there's 15 things under the hood that we've got to build up and fix in order to get to this really simple outcome of automating process XYZ. Sometimes people don't understand how deep that rabbit hole actually goes, because we're in a situation now, technology-wise, where everything has been built on the shoulders of giants. It's cliche, I know, but when you look at public cloud and what sits underneath public cloud, you've kind of taken away all of the hardware maintenance and all of the stuff that used to do in old school data centers. You've given that over to somebody else to manage. But all of the stuff that sits underneath there, it's still somebody else's data center. There's still all these processes and procedures and things that go in place to keep those systems up and running. You just don't see them anymore. So people just think, oh, flick the switch on and servers come up. Well, there's an army of people and automated processes that sit behind that to make that happen properly. And the more we abstract ourselves away from the actual technology, and the more these services come out where you just push a button and the service runs, or we have more AI thingamabobs that end up taking care of things just by, typing in a question or a statement into a chat window and answers come back or things happen, the less that we'll really understand how the engine of technology works. So you always have to have some clued in people to understand how that works. But I think we're seeing the emergence of a lot of people coming onto boards that do have that technology background. You're starting to see CIOs and CISOs that have been in industry now for 10, 15, 20 years that have a really good understanding of how this tech fits together. They're starting to become company directors or non-executive directors and advise boards and advise startups and these kind of things. So I think we'll slowly be seeing that change, but we're at a bit of a tipping point, if you will, at the moment.
So, Fred, what do you think people overlook perhaps when it comes to business resilience? Is there anything that comes to mind when I ask you that question?
One of the things that I think people overlook is, business resilience has a lot to do with keeping business continuity, keeping the business running. But oftentimes, and I think this is changing as well, cybersecurity isn't really seen as a business continuity issue. And from my perspective, and if you talk to people in the critical infrastructure space, this is second nature to them, because any issue that takes down their core systems, especially critical infrastructure systems, that's something that they have to have a scenario for. So in my mind, cybersecurity is just another business continuity issue. So I think it's really important that we pay attention to cyber and really build in cyber and some of those critical things that could happen into the business continuity process, right? It's not all incident responders responding to an incident. There's a larger play here where if the business is impacted, there has to be that business decision-making framework in place to understand, okay, this is impacted, this is how we're dealing with the situation, and these are the decisions that are going to need to be made. So I think, that's one thing that I think people do overlook. And the second thing I think is that, we've already talked about it, I think, is that business resilience is really about business continuity. So it's really about bouncing back in that face of adversity. And we just need to be prepared for as much as we can, so that we have the skills to be able to respond to anything that may come up in normal BC language. And then finally, I think business continuity is really seen as that dirty word. the dusty spreadsheet in the corner. You go and blow it off once a year and once every 2 years, and you kind of hope for the best, and you identify your systems and that kind of thing. Now, one of the things that we're seeing that's changing that is a lot of regulation is coming up. That cybersecurity bill that just went through Parliament here in Australia, for example, that specifically calls out business continuity and making sure your cybersecurity incident response plans involve your business continuity framework. So, we're starting to see these things come together. At the end of the day, cyber's not really a special snowflake. It really should be built in and baked into everything we do in operations. And I feel like sometimes that gets separated a little bit because there are so many unknowns and so many specialty skills required in the cyberspace that often we lose the plot and try to make it, a little bit bigger than something it actually is.
So you said before bouncing back during adversity. So how confident would you be that businesses or a lot of businesses would be able to do that and do it quickly?
I guess it depends on your business, right? If you're providing critical infrastructure, you see a lot of regulation coming now about critical infrastructure bill, all of the different things that need to be put in place. And a lot of it's regulatory compliance, but the heart is in the right place. And that the reason that all this reg compliance is coming down is because exactly your question, we need to be resilient, especially when you're talking about food, water, clothing, transportation, education, healthcare, these kind of things. The amount of time you can be without those is very small. So regulators see that no progress is being made. So regulators make laws and regs to push that in to our environments. The outage does raise a lot of concerns around that. When half the planet goes down because a piece of software blue screened, that raises a lot of concerns. And I think you have a lot of people looking at that scenario going, when it happens again, because it will, maybe not the same software, but we're dependent on a lot of pieces of software these days. How am I going to deal with that? So what % of the world's companies can bounce back and are ready for anything? Your guess is probably as good as mine, but we do the best we can. But I think we need to do more, and we need to test this stuff. So I think that's part of what the regs do, and it's part of what we do as CIOs and CISOs, and keeping the business who's inherently focused on technology, keeping it running.
So I want to sort of switch gears now slightly, and I want to talk about maybe some of the factors that comprise business resilience, or what's driving a lot of this. Anything you can share?
We've talked some about them, but I guess just to kind of tick down some of the things that I think about and some of the questions you go through when you're doing any kind of business resilience exercise. So your systems, what are the most critical systems in your business that run your core business, right? Identifying those systems first and foremost, and having those be a part of your plan is first and foremost, right? Visibility is everything. And then it's understanding not everything is the same criticality. Everything's a high risk, nothing's a high risk kind of thing, but you need to understand the criticality of those systems. So I mentioned C1, C2, C3, C4 earlier. It's all about understanding how critical is that system to performing my core business, and how long can I live without it? That'll start to find things like what are your uptime requirements for those systems? How often do those systems need to be backed up? What do we do in case of an emergency? And when is it that we do need to enact that redundant system to take care and make sure that our business is resilient and continuous? How long can you tolerate those systems being down? We talked a little bit about that. What happens if you're outside of that tolerance? So if your system is, if your business processes are good enough for 4 hours, according to your BC process, if you're butting up against those 4 hours, or the business is really starting to hurt without that, where's the decision-making framework to then go and spin up the next thing that takes the place of that particular system? What happens as you approach that limitation? What happens if you're outside that tolerance? Do you continue to operate without it? Do you spin up something else, etc.? So understanding that tolerance is huge. Scenario training, and really taking all of that information about your systems and developing a scenario for the areas that you're not resilient in, because often when you do this exercise of going through, here are my most critical systems, here's what we can't live without for how long, you always wind up with a situation going, oh, I didn't realize we really couldn't live without that system. We don't understand what we would do if that wasn't available. How would we keep the business running? How would we process orders, etc.? And then the decision-making framework is really important. And I kind of liken this to, I do a bit of sailing on the weekends. And one of the things that you never want to do as a sailor is be out in the middle of the ocean and having to test your emergency equipment for the first time in an emergency in the middle of the ocean. So you take courses around sea safety and survival, and you learn how to use life jackets, and you learn how to use big life rafts, and you learn how to use flares and all the things that you keep at the bottom of your boat that you hopefully never need. It's a lot the same with decision-making framework. You do not want to be in a situation where you have to run the business and continue to run the business without understanding what role people are playing in decisions, who's making the ultimate calls. If you're doing this for the first time under crisis situations, bad things are going to happen, and you're going to get the left hand not talking to the right. You're going to get customer comms going out one way when they should have gone another. Really gnarly things can start happening. So really understanding and testing. You can't test enough. You can't train enough for this stuff. We all have limited amount of time in a day, so we have to pick and choose what we test, but you really can't train enough. It's a bit like the military. You just can't train enough. So really understanding who's making the call is super important.
So the example that you used around the sailing. So, and I want to talk a little bit more about like scenario training. So I've heard that a lot in interviews and in companies. But then, to your example, if you're out in the ocean and you haven't done the training at the life jackets and the flares, like you really do have a problem. And when you were talking through that, how often have people gotten on a plane and they do the old safety stuff? I mean, if something were to happen, I probably wouldn't know how to handle that. All the flights I've taken in my life and everyone else. Like, would you say that we can do this training and this planning, but then when the day happens, there's still people, they panic and they don't know how to deal in, high pressure situations. People that their critical thinking, like their mind is not where it was when we were doing scenario and stuff like that. How do you manage that as well? Because we've seen this multiple times, like in companies that I've worked at. And it's like, well, it was all good and then something's now happened and now people are panicked. How do you manage that when you're in an incident and decisions do need to be made and perhaps people aren't as effective as their thinking was when they were doing the scenario training?
Yep. Well, we're all human and we all have emotions, and the flight or fight kind of things take over. I mean, our brains are hardwired for that. So there will always be that in any kind of an emergency, right? Or any kind of crisis situation or any kind of high pressure environment. That's just who we are as humans. I hate to sound like a broken record, but going back to training, the more you train for these kinds of things, the more it becomes muscle memory and you don't really have to think about it. When customers are breathing down your neck and you're actually getting 40 customer calls and it's flooding your call center and you don't have an answer and people are angry or they're threatening to take their business elsewhere, there's pressures that you just can't feel in a scenario. But when you do have those decision frameworks and the scenarios set up, one of the things that I've seen is that this isn't we're going to practice for a month and then be done practicing, or it's not we're going to develop a real life scenario and put everybody through it in real time. A lot of times these scenarios build up over the course of months and years. So for example, if you've never done scenario training within your exec team, you start really simple. You start by identifying those really high critical applications and systems. Then you go and develop a scenario around that. You well inform the team that you're going to get together early on, and you do a bunch of pre-training. Here's what you can expect on the day. Here's what's going to happen. We're going to walk you through everything, etc. And then on the day, you might introduce a few lightweight scenario, sort of choose your own adventure decision points, but you're really there to facilitate and walk people through that. Okay, there's a way through this, right? Especially if you've not done it before. And over time, what you do is you build upon that, especially if you've got a consistent exec team, you build upon that and you ratchet up the heat in those scenarios. So let's say you're doing 2 in a year, 4 in a year, the first year, and a couple in a year, the second year. You really want to start getting more and more towards that real life scenario. So almost role playing in real time, how things are going to play out. So in the most mature companies, when you think about, in Australia, banking and insurance and the companies that have been doing this for a long time, they'll take full days out with, 50, 60 execs in a room and in real time, role play out a scenario. Somebody actually does call the CEO and initiate something. CEO actually has to call these people, actually has to convene a meeting in a boardroom somewhere with the right people for the decisions that need to be made, working through all of those things. And it's all recorded and, looked at for lessons learned and revisiting. So that's the right side of the spectrum, or there's the left side where you're just getting going. So I think ratcheting that up over time and really getting people trained up and putting the pressure, whilst it might sound a little bit cheesy, that artificial pressure can actually feel really real when you're in a room with a facilitator who's really driving those questions. Or if you're really getting a call from what sounds like an angry customer, your brain can't help but go to that flight or fight kind of scenario. So the more you can train those sounds a little bit weird, but train those feelings out, or the more that you can make those scenarios more muscle memory, the better you're going to perform in a crisis situation.
So can I ask more of a rudimentary question? And I know it's going to be, it depends, but I'm just curious on giving some examples, look at banking, for example. Or what would your response to a bank, how often they should be doing these things, like with executives and, their team and their, the general counsel and all the people that are involved, what would that sort of plan look like to you? Like how often and like, the frequency of it, like, the length of it. Do you have any sort of example that you've used in the past, perhaps, just to sort of paint a picture for people?
Yeah, look, I think annually for mature companies is appropriate. And you don't want to test the same scenario every time. So if I look at cybersecurity scenarios, ransomware has come up over and over again. And, I've seen endless amount of scenarios built around ransomware for the last couple, 3-4 years, right? Because ransomware has broad effect on a company and it's an easy one to kind of lean back on and have mass impacts across the company. So I think that annual scenario is really important to do for mature companies. But I think building up to that, if you're just getting started out, there's nothing wrong with taking 20 or 30 or 40 minutes in a monthly ELT session. You do it 4 times a year, maybe, and just really lightweight scenario training about things you've learned about your business continuity, what it is that people need to focus on, and just start training up to that ultimate 1-year annual kind of scenario. You're starting to see it a lot in regulations as well, where, scenario must be, you've got to test your business continuity or cybersecurity incident response plan once a year. So it's starting to be mandated and people see the value out of it. Invariably, nobody likes to go into these scenarios because, nobody likes to be exposed or nobody likes to be in a scenario where they don't know the answer, but often that's where you learn the most. So checking your ego at the door a little bit and understanding that we're not going to have all the answers when you go into a scenario, that's a good thing because you're going to get some learnings out of it. And you're going to be able to take that back into the business and the operational teams and actually make that better so that you don't run into the situation that you're testing.
So Fred, do you have any sort of closing comments or final thoughts you'd like to leave our audience with today?
Business continuity, business resilience, it's not a dirty word anymore. It can't be. We've got to think about that as a core thing that we build all of our business processes around, whether it's cybersecurity, physical security, or any other kind of resilience testing within your business. We've got to know what the weak points are, because the more you can really pick at those weak points, the better off you're going to be and the better prepared you're going to be for anything that might come down the line. So better to test often, even if it is a big time commitment, than it is to be caught out without the right decision-making framework, without the right people in the room, or without understanding what those critical business processes are. So dust off that BC, the business continuity playbook, get it out and start testing as much as you possibly can.
This is KBcast, the voice of cyber.
Thanks for tuning in. For more industry-leading news and thought-provoking articles, visit kbi.media to get access today.
This episode is brought to you by Mercsec, your smarter route to security talent. Mercsec's executive search has helped enterprise organizations find the right people from around the world since 2012. Their on-demand talent acquisition team helps startups and mid-sized businesses scale faster and more efficiently. Find out more at mercsec.com today.